This is our first talk of the year, so we're very happy to have with us Jose Luis Mendez, who's really proved that a PITT PhD can serve you well. I won't say in one year he graduated from us, worked with Bert in the back, most of the guy Peters, who's the person who instigated this whole talk. So we're very happy with the Center for Latin American Studies to be able to welcome you back to PITT. I guess you were back one other time, is that right?
A couple of times.
But anyway, Jose Luis, in addition to having a very successful career at the prestigious El Colegio de Mexico, was the speechwriter for Vicente Fox, the first democratically elected president, I guess we would say, or at least from the opposition, in Mexico for 3 years. He held another important government posts, including, what was your title with the ministry? Head of the ministry?
No, the head of the civil service.
Of the civil service, which was a policy that he instigated from within the Vicente Fox administration. So really interesting. A little bit that I heard about it sounds really fascinating. Talking about, when we think about our history, this is what they were trying to do, so institute a meritocratic system which they'd never had before. So he's got lots of wonderful stories to tell, and he's going to tell us a little bit about an academic one here, talking about leadership and strategies in Mexico. So thank you very much for being here. We're looking forward to the talk.
No, thank you very much, Scott, and thanks for the center, and to the Policy Department for the invitation.
And to guide,
and to guide too, to be here. Many thanks for being here and for your interest in this topic. Well, I'm going to then talk about this topic of presidential leadership and strategic action. Using the cases of Calderon and Peña in Mexico and Collor and Cardoso in Brazil. It is a research in which I've been working for some time, but of course it's still research in progress, as you say, and so your comments will be very welcome, of course. I think I'm going to be talking for maybe 20-25 minutes. Maybe I have too many slides and I'm going to skip some of them, but this is more or less what I wanted to talk to you about today. First, theoretical discussion on the significance of presidential leadership as a dependent variable, as an object of study. Then defining presidential leadership as dependent variable and strategic action as independent variable. I'm trying to differentiate these two aspects of leadership, taking one as dependent variable, I'm going to define it in a minute, and then taking strategic action as the independent variable. And then going to the case of Mexico, and going to the case of Brazil. Maybe I won't have too much time to describe this in detail, but we will see. Okay, so first, why is political leadership important? I would have two types of reasons. First, theoretical reasons and practical reasons. The theoretical reasons have to do with sort of, well, in a way, complementing neo-institutionalism, which, as everybody knows, sort of brought attention to institutions as a very important variable or factor to understand political processes. And of course, institutions are important, but I think that actors too, of course. And maybe the neo-institutionalism brought too much attention, or only attention to institutions, forgetting a little bit about actors. So I think it's important to ask how and when actors are important in political processes as well as institutions. And as to the practical reasons, well, here I give you some Latino barometer figures for 2016. Only 34% of the population in Latin America is satisfied with the democratic regime, which I think is worrisome. Only 2% 22% of the population considers that governments rule in the interest of all, for instance. While in 2009 presidential approval was 60% on average in the region, now it's at 38% presidential approval on average in the region. And Latinobarometro says that, well, the main problem is that social demands have not been really fulfilled in the region, and that's why we are getting these very low figures, which I think make presidential leadership important so that people in the region can get more inclusion, less inequality, and some public goods. I think political leadership is very important for that, and maybe if political leadership could help to get those goods, these figures will rise. And then democracy could become a little bit more stable since people support more democracy. Okay, so, but if presidential leadership is important, the next question is, what is presidential leadership, right? And how can we explain presidential leadership, and to that extent, how can we achieve presidential leadership? I find that in the literature, presidential leadership has been mostly conceived based on achievement only. When I think that really the level of achievement depends to a great extent on context. Some contexts are more favorable for achievement, for achieving results than others. And so I think that really an accurate or a more accurate notion of leadership will require, of course, achievement, which is a key dimension of leadership, but not only achievement. Also, the consideration of context together with achievement, which is what I'm going to try to do. And I think that will give us a more accurate and fair notion of leadership and leaders, as we will see. So this paper I've been working on has two main aims. First, developing leadership as a dependent variable, considering both the level of achievement and restrictions on the one hand. And on the other hand, developing strategic action as an independent variable of presidential leadership, contingently defined, as I was saying, in contrast to other independent variables which have been presented in the literature to explain presidential leadership, such as vision, charisma, juncture, or even institutions. So, the main hypotheses that I've been trying to support are first that the level of presidential leadership will be positively related to the level of presidential strategic action. And well, I study these cases I mentioned in Latin America, and in these cases, I'm finding out that what this general hypothesis means is that high levels of achievement in context of multi-party democracies and divided government are positively related to the use of what I would call soft power, coalitional type of strategies, that's a strategic action, rather than what I would call hard power, plebiscitarian types of strategies. So I will link high levels of achievement. In this context, this Latin American context, I will link high levels of achievement with this type of strategy on the one hand. But on the other hand, I also have found out that political leadership involves also the lack of lingering governmental crisis, which in turn is related to other type of, maybe we can call it also strategic to some extent, but related to ethical behavior and competent decision-making, as I will try to show in the cases. So I compare then 4 presidencies, Enrique Peña and Felipe Calderón in Mexico, Cardoso and Collor in Brazil. This, well, is obviously a most similar cases research design, as I am comparing Peña to Calderón, so the same country, and Cardoso to Collor, also the same country. We could also compare in a sort of most different, although there things get a little bit complicated because I'm not so sure if a comparison between Brazil and Mexico will be more similar or most different. But in any case, if we take them as most different, we will see the same values in both the dependent and independent variables in the cases, or similar ones in the cases of Cardoso and Peña, and in the cases of Collor and Calderón, meaning higher levels of strategic action and higher levels of political leadership in these 2 cases, and also and then lower levels of strategic action and lower levels of political leadership in these 2 other cases, and so we will find some similarities in most different cases, in a most different case design. But well, I'm not so sure about that, I just mentioned it. What I'm trying to do rather is a more similar cases design, which is a same country type of comparison, 2 presidencies within the same country, because for each pair of these presidencies, I think we can argue that we will have very similar institutional frameworks, very similar level of constitutional powers, same party and electoral systems, same type of divided government. It varied, of course, a little bit. I think between Collor and Cardoso there were some changes, and maybe to some extent also between Calderón and Peña, but I don't think that they will be so different as for a more similar cases research design not to work. And even, I mean, despite the fact that, or in this same similar context, I think that in each of these countries, one of the 2 presidents showed higher levels of presidential leadership, as well as higher levels of strategic action. And since everything else is the same value in these variables cannot explain different values in these other variables. So you know that's the logic of a more similar cases research design. As I said, well, although I've been working on this for some time, this is still research in progress, and so any comments are very welcome. Okay, so I said that presidential leadership should be considered based both on restrictions and achievements. How am I defining then restrictions? I don't have time really to get too much into each of these, in the description of each of these types, but as a point of departure, I begin with Sporonek's work on defining 4 types of contexts. But also, I consider some additional aspects of constraints or restrictions. As to achievements, I mostly base my conception of achievements in Hall's work on his typology of policy change, 3rd level, 2nd level, and 1st level, according to the extent to which a reform is paradigmatic, change in goals, or is only a change in tools, adding some other elements to that conception. So we come to this table or graph in which on one side I have restrictions, level of restrictions, low, medium, and high, and on the other hand I have level of achievements, low, medium, and high. These 2 then, as I said, will be the 2 dimensions on which political leadership should be considered. And based on that, we will have different values, different degrees of political leadership. From a very low presidential leadership, when a president reaches a very low level of achievements, but in a low level of restrictions. In other words, in a very favorable context for presidential leadership, for instance, when you have a crisis and some other favorable conditions for political leadership, because if you have a crisis, well, you have an opportunity, right, to solve that crisis. You have an opportunity to become a leader. That's what I would call a low level of restrictions for leadership. If in a very favorable condition you do not get results, you get a very low level of presidential leadership. In contrast, if you don't have a crisis, but still you are able to get a very high level of achievement, then that's when I would put a very high presidential leadership, which is, I would say, very rare, but still possible. Or at least, for instance, you will have here a high presidential leadership when you get a high level of achievements in a medium level of restrictions. So that's the way I'm trying to look at presidential leadership. Again, considering both achievements, but also restrictions. I don't think you can consider leadership then only based on achievements.
And just a clarification question. What are the level of restrictions in terms of? Maybe I missed it.
In terms of...
So higher restrictions means higher institutional constraints on the president, or less? Or?
This is in terms of the restrictions to be a leader.
Okay.
So, for instance, if you have a crisis, you have a low level of restrictions to become a leader, right? Because a crisis, as I was saying, is an opportunity to become a leader. This is the way Skoronek takes actually the context, sort of in the other way. So a crisis is a favorable condition to for leadership, right? So in that case, you will be here. Is what Skoronek calls reconstruction type of context. Also, for instance, if you are a president from the opposition, considering the previous president, what Skoronek calls an opposition president, you are here too, because you can criticize the previous president and you can propose new policies and then become more of a leader, proposing new policies. So here, in this case, we will have context or conditions in which, for instance, there is a crisis, what Skoronek calls status quo vulnerable to change, right? So you have favorable conditions to becoming a leader, but even then, you cannot get achievements. So you get very favorable conditions to get a high level of achievements, because that, I mean, you have a crisis, you have the opportunity to solve the crisis and then get here. But as we will see, and I'm going ahead a little bit here, Collor was a president who had these conditions. Opposition president, hyperinflation crisis, etc., etc., but he couldn't get here. Actually, he stayed here. Right? While Cardoso, facing not so favorable conditions for leadership, was able to achieve, as I will define, a high level of presidential leadership. If I have time, I will get a little bit more into that, but I will try to finish perhaps in around 10 minutes, so that we can have some time for discussion. There is a paper, by the way, in case anything is interested, there is a paper where I developed all these, and the paper has a theoretical discussion section in which I discuss the strategic action. All this discussion is about trying to go back. all this previous discussion is about presidential leadership as a dependent variable defined in terms of restrictions and achievements. But now, in the paper, I also discussed then the independent variable, meaning strategic action as the independent variable. There is a long tradition stressing the importance of actors and strategic action. I'm not going to really go into this. In Latin America, I have found out some authors trying to bring back the role of actors against institutions, as CLAS-PITT, for instance, who have been working on strategy to the extent that we have been working on to what extent presidents are skillful at coalition management or not. Mainware and Perlignan, they don't work so much on strategy, but they work on the preferences of presidents and the effects that they have had on the democratic stability, for instance. In any case, well, I think there is, or can be defined, a strategic action approach in which, or which would say that equilibrium is not kept by institutions, but also by the strategic moves of the holders of institutions against the opponents. And then institutions, ideologies, junctures, all those types of structural conditions will frame, of course, the action of agents. But the argument of this approach is that agents still have choices to make within those frames, and they take those choices as a function of other factors more related to actors than to institutions, and also that the choices actors make are very important for the result in terms of the policy process, the political process, and also the political outcomes. So I'm trying to sort of rescue, in a way, this approach for the understanding of presidential leadership. And in the paper I define, or try to define as precisely as possible, what I mean by strategic action, which is not so easy to do, but I define two realms in which strategic action can happen: agenda setting and political action itself, right? Agenda setting, for instance, to what extent you present very ambitious or less ambitious goals according to the context. I think that's a strategic decision. Whether you use a rifle or shotgun type of strategy when you negotiate issues in Congress. For instance, if the issue is quite agreeable between the different political parties, usually it's said that you should use a rifle type of strategy. Only one bill at a time. If the bill you're trying to push is very divisive or very conflictive, you present several bills at the same time so that you can negotiate with the opposition. So again, the strategy is very important here. Also, whether or not you present the bills within the so-called honeymoon period of Congress, maybe the first year or later. That's another strategic move that you can use. And as to political action, what I said, either soft power coalitional type of strategies or hard power plebiscitarian types of strategies. Now, well, the cases in my last 5 minutes, very quickly. Calderon faced, I think, a medium level of restriction. He was an affiliated president because belonged to the same political party as his predecessor, Fox. But the status quo, however, was very vulnerable to change, so that this made a favorable conditions or context for leadership. He had good approval ratings, which is another dimension I use for defining restrictions. But and he had an important legislative support. He had no majority in Congress, but he was not so far away from majority. That's why I call his level of restrictions medium. However, he reached what I would say is a low level of achievement. Why? Well, because he was only able to reach rather incremental types of reforms on the one hand, but perhaps most importantly, he failed in what was his main policy goal, which was really reducing violence and fighting crime. It was actually, it got worse. With his policies, it got worse. So we got a strong public security crisis, and so that's why I put him in a lower level of achievement. And if we have, according to the table I just showed you, if we have a low level of achievement in the context of a medium level of restriction, we will have a low level of presidential leadership. Now, why he had a low level of presidential leadership? Because he was not strategic enough. That's my argument. He was regarding the agenda setting, he was not strategic enough because he was under-ambitious in the policy areas most vulnerable to change, like education or telecommunications, where really everybody was calling for a reform. He didn't present a reform bill, and was over-ambitious in the one more resilient to change, more difficult really to face, which was crime and violence. Actually, he put this at the center of his agenda, fighting crime, and I think that was a strategic mistake doing that. Also, he followed wrong legislative strategies. He, in the most divisive reform bills, such as energy, he used, instead of using a shotgun type of strategy, he used a rifle type of strategy, presenting the energy bill as the only bill to be negotiated. That was a strategic mistake, I think. And he didn't present that in the honeymoon period when his power was at the best or at the highest, but waited till the second year, which also was a strategic mistake. Regarding political action, he did not develop a governmental coalition and predominantly relied on a hard power plebiscitarian type of political strategy. If we compare this with Peña, we will see, maybe I can come back to this, but maybe it will be good to then go directly to Peña political action. Peña did develop a coalition from the very beginning called the Pact for Mexico, used a rifle type of strategy for the more agreeable bills and a shotgun type of strategy, for instance, for the energy policy. He presented all these bills within the honeymoon period of in Congress, just to show you the contrast. But Peña, going back to the restrictions, Peña was an opposition president, so that was favorable for leadership, and the regime was still vulnerable to change. On the other hand, he had only a slight majority in the House of Representatives, which was also favorable, but he had other obstacles. He had a lower level of approval. So that's why I also put Peña in a medium level of restrictions. He so far, I would argue, Peña has got a medium level of achievement because of two reasons. A good one and a bad one. The good one is that he was able to really push for paradigmatic structural reforms in education, telecommunications, etc., on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have been facing very important governmental crises like Ayotzinapa, on the one hand, with the killings there, The White House, I don't have too much time to get into this, maybe in the questions, if you haven't heard of what this is, I can explain more. The White House, the Chapo escaped from Yale, and maybe Trump now. Maybe I take off the maybe. Trump. And even more now that Clinton, I think, said that she will not come to Mexico. So even worse. So a medium level of achievements in a medium level of restrictions involve a medium level of presidential leadership. Well, my time is out, but I do I already talked about how Peña was more strategic. I do the same thing for color. I mean, I'm not going to get into all this, but it's the same logic for color. Low level of restrictions, as I said, opposition president, the first president elected by the people in Brazil, very high approval rates, etc., but low level of achievement. He was only able to privatize some companies, but failed in his most important goal, which was curbing inflation. He didn't get that. And also, he got into a governmental crisis too, and when he was about to be impeached, he had to resign. So, low level of achievement in a favorable context of low restrictions would involve a low level of presidential leadership. Why? Because he followed a rather hard-powered plebiscitarian strategy instead of building a coalition. Some economic mistakes, and also unethical and questionable actions that led to the crisis. And finally, Cardoso, a medium level of restriction because he was an affiliated president, but on the other hand, he had a somewhat still vulnerable regime, but he had a very small political party with low legislative power, which was an obstacle for leadership at the beginning. However, what I would say was a high level of achievements. Several constitutional or, in other cases, legal reforms in different areas, getting inflation from 1,000% per year to only 50%, some privatizations, some improvements in health, but maybe these two, I think, allow me to put him in a high level of achievements. So, then to conclude, why? Because he formed an ample coalitional government, as I was saying. He also followed a good legislative strategy, introducing, for instance, the more agreeable bills first to build political capital. He personally coordinated the negotiation of reforms. He really, kept an ethical behavior and did sound economic decision making. So we come to this to finish. Where I put color here in a very favorable conditions for leadership, very low achievements. In a medium level of restrictions, also low achievements. In a medium level of restrictions too, medium level of achievements because of what I explained. And on the other hand, in the medium level of restrictions, a high level of achievement. So I think that in this case, these four cases within a more similar case in research design will provide empirical support. I'm not saying, of course, that these cases allow me to provide empirical support as to say in a very solid or completely solid way that this is an explanation, but I think that there is some empirical evidence supporting this hypothesis that presidential leadership is to some extent, maybe to a great extent, I'm fighting with that, but explained by strategic action, the way I define it, and I think that this is more or less what I said at the beginning, and I think that all this to some extent also reveals the importance of actors and not only institutions in the explanation of political processes and actions in Latin America and elsewhere.
that we're supposed to announce that if people need to leave early, there is a back door out here, so they don't be disturbed. But thank you for the talk, and we have a little bit of time for some questions and answers.
I have a question.
Would you be able to talk a little bit more about the characteristics that would define high restrictions in that category of the environment for presidential leadership?
Here, so we have here the level of restrictions, and in this case, you will have a high level of restrictions when you don't have a crisis, for instance, right? When you are an affiliated president, the same party as your predecessor, so you cannot really fight the president and propose different policies and then have some leadership, right? Because you have to be, to some extent, loyal to the previous president. So it's a high level of restrictions to become a leader or to accept political leadership because you are an president. The status quo, perhaps, for instance, the previous president made all the reforms that supposedly were needed, so you are left with no reforms to make. Then you have a high level of restrictions for political leadership, right? This gets a little bit confusing sometimes about restrictions for what, but again, here I'm talking about restrictions for political leadership based on the work of Coronet mainly, but some other people as well. So, I don't know how
Yeah, thank you very much.
A couple of thoughts for what there were. Thank you very much for a really interesting, intriguing, provoking presentation and sharing your work with us. The first thing is, maybe I'm just thinking about this incorrectly, but the restrictions really are story or element or continuation of amount of discretion that the president has. So the way you define high is really a high discretionary context, whereas if they're dealing with a crisis down in the low or reconstruction, they have little discretion. They just have to make sure people are being fed, the military is working, buildings are being rebuilt, etc. So it may help to sort of think of level of restrictions, especially since it's going from low to high, performance is improving in restrictions, as discretion that the president has. Because the way you defined it in the beginning, the high restriction signifies that the president has the most discretion to undertake policies of their own choosing rather than responding to crises or being hamstrung by other kinds of exogenous events. And it fits with your story, it's just, when you're calling it level of restrictions, in the direction in which it increases, it improves performance, I'm thinking of it more as a discretionary context confronting presidents. The higher values mean they have more discretion, they're less hamstrung by exogenous crises and other events. Just something, I mean, it fits with your current story, it just, yeah, I think it would help, at least from my perspective, because I thought of this, I wrote down a plot equation, for, new institutionalism, because you used that term in the beginning. So it's basically individual choice times institutions equals policy, right? And that's what I was thinking of that. So discretionary context was one thing. The other thing is, and maybe this, I'm not thinking about this correctly, but in your story, leadership is the outcome of achievements. The way it's represented,
achievement is a dimension of leadership. We could use it as a cause effect, but in this case, I'd rather take achievement as an aspect or a dimension of leadership. And I'm not trying to, although eventually we look at that way, but in this case, because then if I use it that way, it's more confusing. Because my independent variable is strategic action. My dependent variable is presidential leadership, defined as achievement in certain conditions.
It's like marginal leadership. And the economist, that's subject to the constraints.
Right. So this is the dependent variable, so that's what I don't use the outcome of. but achievement is a part of the content of leadership. But I need to
Help me, I'm sorry, maybe I'm just not following. So achievements, are they contemporaneous achievements or past achievements? So I'm in office, right? I'm Calderon. I've had some achievements in my first year in office. Is that emboldened my leadership in the next period? Well, or is this something that's really sort of coterminous in that they're related at the same time? And that's where I'm sort of trying to tease out the causality, because typically leadership results into outcomes, which are achievements, and so maybe I'm not thinking about it correctly.
Yeah, you point to one important issue, which is the fact that, defining leadership is a true mess.
Yeah, it's really hard.
Because
absolutely right.
Sometimes, leadership is seen, strategic action through which you achieve achievements is considered part of leadership. And we were discussing this with Scott in the morning, and I think that's very enlightening to me, and I haven't looked at that, so maybe I should work on that better, right? But
you're right. Psychology. I'm just trying to get my head around it.
The problem I'm finding is that a lot of people see leadership as both strategy and results, right? And see leadership as the independent variable of results as the dependent variable, right? Here, I'm looking at some other way in considering leadership as achievement under certain constraints, and looking at the strategic action as the independent variable. But the problem is that, again, often is considered that other way. But however, I would argue, and that's what I was arguing with Scott in the morning, that really leadership, strategic action should not be considered part of the leadership, should not be part of the dependent variable. Because for me, leadership is getting a country, a group, or whatever, let's say from A to B, right? Moving, leading, right? That should be leadership. How you get that, for me, is not leadership. It's the independent variable of leadership. How you get a community, nation, or whatever from here to here, how do you do it, wouldn't be part of leadership. That will be here in a way, right? Now, I would add to these constraints. Leading a country from here to here, given certain constraints. If it's very difficult to get a country from here to here, then you have a grand leader. Because it was not only, you are not judging this leader only on the extent to which he or she was able to lead the country from here to here, but if he did it in very favorable conditions, for instance, from an economic crisis to stability and growth, but that was the result of the market itself, of the economic cycle. I argue we should not consider that a leader, because it was not his work, right? If this is a very difficult crisis, and it was because of the leader, really, that the country came from A to B, well, then you have leadership. And that was because of his strategic action. But I would put the strategic action here, and you do not always have a strategic action. Collor, for instance, was here, and he wanted to bring the country Brazil from here to here, and he couldn't. He moved it maybe like this, because he was not strategic. While Cardoso moving really from here to here with all the structural reforms and control of the inflation, etc., because he was strategic. So I would favorable condition like a crisis, etc., for leadership will not necessarily involve leadership if you do not act strategically. I think that this is important because I think it's important that presidents become more strategic for the sake of the democratic stability and results. So it's a theoretical reason, as I said, regarding the importance of factors and what they do or not in political science, but also it has some practical implications. For instance, Fox, to which Scott said I work with, Fox had a very low level of restrictions for leadership, very favorable conditions for leadership, opposition president, reconstruction type of times, etc., etc. But he stayed here. He didn't move really the country to a high level of achievement because he was not strategic. He followed a rather plebiscitarian type of strategy instead of building a coalition, as Peña did. And then Peña moved the country, from here, well, more or less to here, let's say. But Fox didn't, and I fought a lot with all the advisors in Fox administration. I was a speechwriter, but I also participated in decision making. When they were following this strategy, Fox going to the bully pulpit and try to pressure Congress through the people, I said, this is wrong. In Mexico, you have no re-election. So the representatives just don't care about what the people think about them because there is no re-election. So this is wrong. This is leading nowhere. And it sounds easy to say, but it led nowhere. So no fiscal reform, no energy reform, no education reform, no airport, no nothing with Fox. Big disappointment because of a wrong strategy.
As you said, we had an hour-long discussion about this morning, and kind of going along the way you were going. One of the suggestions I had was change leadership to the word legacy, and constraints plus achievements makes your legacy in a sense. That was one of the ways we're arguing it. I had one more thought that we sort of looked at this morning was instead of achievements, since that's really the strategy, you really differentiate when we were talking about Fox as well this morning about, and the other presidents as you do in the paper, the difference between the plebiscitarian strategy and the coalitional strategy. And you basically are arguing the coalitional strategy is what allowed these presidents to be successful, and Fox and others who followed the plebiscitarian ones were not. So couldn't that other axis then be a strategy? Because that would more clearly separate achievements from the idea of leadership. So if you put that, so could, instead of achievements, use the actual strategy. Did the president use a plebiscitarian strategy versus a coalition?
Yeah, I could, but I don't know if then I will get into sort of endogeneity problems, because then I will put the independent variable inside the dependent variable.
I don't think so, because I think leadership and achievements are the same variable. That's what we were arguing about.
Me too.
But so if that was the strategy, that was as you said, is exogenous in this sense. Is what strategy they use, plus whether they had opportunities to fight a war or hyperinflation, and so that gives you the opportunity to use leadership or to create a legacy. That was.
Well, maybe, but I don't know. I guess one of the problems is that this is a little bit it overlaps, or at least seem to overlap. But for instance, I don't know, education reform in Mexico. I think you could consider Peña a leader to the extent that he was able to push for, that he reached or was able to push Congress to pass, or rather that education reform was passed. Right? That's the achievement. So there was leadership. The very fact that education reform passed, that's achievement. And for me, for the definition of leadership, I will leave it there. The fact that education reform passed That's the dependent variable. How Peña did through a coalition, how he managed to get that result is the independent variable. So I wonder if I put it here, I would be mixing the independent variable.
How he got there is he used coalitional strategy instead of coalition.
Right.
So that explains the reason we get it. That's my
So,
Why did Fox ignore you when you said that the fact was
Oh.
the election?
well,
because he was
because he was traveling all the time.
I mean, he got, you know,
And I mean, he was not part of these discussions. Rarely he was there. Maybe that was part
But
of
that's
it.
how you define plebiscitarian. He didn't care about the congressional debates. He wanted to use plebiscite. So that fits your discussion perfectly.
He liked it a lot, being with the people, talking to the people, going to, being among the people, talking to the people, making speeches to the people. So I was busy all the time too, because he was talking so much.
But see, with the larger, this leads to the larger question. If you think about Fernando Collor, he clearly did not understand that appointing your friends to ministerial positions is neither a wholesale nor a retail strategy in a situation like Brazil. Whereas Cardoso used a much more, what I would call a wholesale strategy, and they in power at least had a strategy that lasted for a long time, more of a mixed retail strategy. Collor didn't do either one. And so in Fox's case and in Collor's case, you have presidents who fundamentally misunderstood or ignored what we as experts, and you as a political expert, would say is the appropriate way to organize a coalition.
That's my argument.
Cardoso clearly did not do that. Cardoso adopted an appropriate strategy because it was very much just a wholesale politics, the proportional distribution of ministerial positions.
Yeah.
That's really one of the things that repeats itself in your discussions, is the presidents have the sense to understand the institutional constraints.
Right. Yeah, and that gets us a little bit to the topic of the personal characteristics and personal capacities of the president to be able to understand or not. I mean, for me, that's a variable behind the strategic action. So strategic action is not the last independent variable. It can be an intervening variable between achievements and some personal capacities to be able to be strategic. But that I don't deal so much with that in this paper. But yes, I mean, presidents will have or not capacities to be strategic. So I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah, just this question of what kind of coalition you can organize depends upon how much give there is in the system to organize it. So if you have a very rigid, set of opposition and support, you better basically have a party, coalition, and that party coalition better be cohesive, theologically coherent, strategically and tactically in tuned. Those are three different levels with the president. That basically describes the current system in the U.S. There is almost no giving it across party lines. And since one of the chambers is, the legislative body is basically non-majoritarian, you've really got two different kinds of strategies, right? I mean, assuming you've got your party in majority control but not super majority control, is you got to play your party in one chamber but not in the other, so that means there's almost no gift, right? And so
I would put that situation here, where it's very difficult to get a coalition because of the political polarization of the political lines. It's very difficult, so it's very difficult really to get achievements because you will be here. But if for any specific reasons or specific great skill or strategic action, at some point the president is able to build a coalition under those conditions, then he will be here. Right? Because with that coalition, he will be able to get a high level of achievements, and then he will be here. So that's the way I would take that situation.
So I'm curious where you would put Chavez on the table.
Oh, I knew that question was coming. Well, he had a majority, right? He had majorities, so that was not a big problem. So I would rather put him around here, and the problem will be judging the achievements, I guess. There's a lot of debate, and it's very illogical, and but given the way Venezuela had been going, I would think put it like around here. After several years of looking at how Venezuela, but I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. So
That again begs the question, though. He passed these structural reforms, and so he implemented the reforms, which is different from the outcome. That was the other thing that we talked about.
Yeah, so that's why I was sort of dubious about whether. But the problem, is that here I'm taking structural reform in itself as an achievement, right? But I'm also taking policy results as an achievement. For instance, in the case of Cardoso Color, whether or not they were able to control inflation, that's a policy result. But also, Color did not structural reforms, Cardoso did structural reforms. So that's a problem indeed with the definition of achievement. But I guess what I'm saying is that when you have a combination of structural reforms, several important structural reforms, even if you still cannot see the results, but several important structural reforms combined with some good and important policy results, then I put a president around here. Even if I have not been able to see the results of those structural reforms. Because there are already some important policy results, so I tend to put them in a medium to high level of achievement. If you do that in a medium to high level of restriction, you will have rather high levels of presidential leadership. But yes, you're right. But in case of Venezuela, well, those structural reforms, I'm not so sure. I'm no expert in Venezuela, so I guess I don't even talk about it. But it doesn't seem to me that the results are very good. But it's just an impression. So that's what I said. I will put him around here.
You have a small empirical problem with Cardoso because you keep claiming that he controlled inflation. But actually, inflation, that's the reason he got elected, was they controlled inflation. I think in terms of the structural reforms, I completely agree with you. But given it's true, his team made a plan under the previous government. He was Minister of the Treasury. That led to the Howell plan and inflation. But that's why he got elected. Right. Because of that. So the sequence is a little bit.
Yeah, you're right about two things, the first I've been told before about is not only the president, it's a team behind the president. There's a little footnote in the paper about that. So that's one thing. The other thing is that yes, you're right. He got elected to some extent because he was able to control inflation to some extent, but not completely. I think that still he got a good policy result of managing to keep inflation going down. And still, by the time he got to the presidency, inflation still was high. And he was able to really keep that trend and take that as a policy result. But you're right. Yeah. Well, yes.
I just have a clarifying question about how you're defining level of restriction. Not to harp on that more, but are you taking it as kind of a running